Let's talk a commotion in your heart.
Okay.
So my first question is always going to be when I see a new book about writing. What was it that made you want to write a book specifically about writing in your writer's journey? And how did you conceive of it originally versus the final product? How close did you get to what you set out to do?
Well, everything I do is a long story. So, to answer your first question, it started out in my mind, and in a way, it still is a book for my students or any person who wants to write. Because I found that the more I taught, the more I sort of understood how things worked and how many different ways things worked, and I wanted people to see that it was a complex, difficult, weird, wonderful, and horrible process, and that was normal. So, I think a lot of people start out and they find, all those things to be true, but they think they must be doing it wrong, that it should be easier than it is, but it's not easy. And so, that was my original thing, to share what I knew about writing with others so that it would, sort of shortcut some things for them, which I think is what a good teacher does, in the classroom or wherever. So originally, the book was titled Driving at Night, which is after an E.L. Doctorow quote that I can't quote exactly, but it's something like, driving without headlights, you could see just as far as the headlights, but you're going to get there eventually. You can only see so far at a time, but if you keep going, you'll get there. And I love that idea that, you don't really know what you're doing a lot of the time, but if you keep at it, the light will come in the right place and you'll get there. And originally it was actually too much of a mix between how-to stuff and personal stuff. And eventually I just dropped the how-to stuff because there are so many books that do that anyway, define point of view and define, dialogue and all those sorts of things. So there are lots of places you can go for that. And eventually it just sort of morphed into this series of small pieces about how I learned things. I have a writing group of 4 people. We call ourselves the 4 Geniuses, tongue-in-cheek, of course. And they were really helpful. And I don't think I would have finished it without them, because I would take these little pieces and I didn't really know exactly what they were, how they were going to go together. And so they just kept saying, yeah, we like it, keep going. So I did. And then eventually, at some point I had enough of them that I could sort of look at them and try to categorize them. And I use spreadsheets a lot in the final process of a novel, or, kind of along the way, and also for revision. So I would just put these things, all these different chapters, on a spreadsheet and sort of move them around and see where they fit. And eventually I came up with what seemed like, the right combination, the right themes. And then it was a book as opposed to just a bunch of stuff. So that's kind of the way it evolved over time.
It's always a wonderful moment when a bunch of stuff becomes a book.
No, it is. It's pretty amazing. And I've always worked chronologically in the past, but the last 2 things I've done, including this, didn't work that way. I couldn't write them chronologically, and in the case of this, I wasn't even sure I was writing a book or what I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted the pieces, and I had some, and I revised some, and whatever. But I just allowed myself to just write in whatever order they would come, and figure that eventually I would figure it out. So it was a new process for me too. And I liked it. It was very freeing, to think that you didn't have to think of what was going to happen next. You could just write what seemed possible to you, and that eventually, it'd be like a puzzle, and it would all fall into place eventually, which it did. It was cool.
Is that something that changes a little bit when you're writing something that's a little bit more biographical, as opposed to when you're writing fiction, it's driving at night, you don't know exactly what's going to happen, whereas a biography, presumably, at least somehow it's going to come out.
Happened, and I knew that it was out there, and I yes, that's true. But the last novel that I finished, which is called About Grace, I haven't found a home for it yet, but it came that way too. It's about a 17-year-old girl who ends up in a juvenile correctional center because she's committed some house robberies with her husband, with not her husband, but her boyfriend, her boyfriend. And he's a rich kid, and she's a middle class, well-to-do kid. And those kids don't usually end up in a place like that, So she ends up there, and while she's there, she sort of has to deal with memories of things that happened to her when she was a child that were not good, and it came in little pieces, just like this did, and I worked on it for a long time, and then I'd put it away, and then I'd get it back out again, and eventually those pieces made a story. I got an arc with them, and boy, that was an interesting process too. And again, that writers group was amazing. I mean, I might have quit any number of times because it was so confusing. And I'll just stop for a second and take the opportunity to say that a writers group is wonderful. If you can find the right people, they have to be people who understand what you're trying to do and have enough technical skill, knowledge of craft, to be able to, help you and give you good advice and see what's wrong with it. But I didn't have a writers group ever. So it's only in the past 4 or 5 years that I've been doing that. And I really advise it. One of the great things about taking classes at the Writers Center or anywhere, going to writers conferences, is that you can find those people. You might find one person in a class that seems like sort of on your same wavelength, and you can kind of go off and then maybe find a third person. I think 4 or 5 is probably ideal. If it gets too big, not so great, at least for me. But anyway, that was just a little segue, and I do think it's really important to have a little community of writers who are your own people, and you guys all know what you're doing and help each other. Very cool.
So let me ask you, because I'm always looking for information on how to run a better writers group. Not that the Young Adult Cannibals, as esteemed audience knows, is doing great, but for other people out there that are running their writers groups, what steps do you take to make sure that when you're meeting, that's going to be a productive meeting, and that everybody's going to come to it and do the work and be the geniuses that you're expecting them to be?
They really are. Well, I think part of that is choosing the right people who really want to work, and it's not a social occasion for them, but it is an opportunity to work together. What we do is we usually talk for 20 minutes and catch up with each other, and then we go to the manuscripts, and that's what we do for the rest of the time. And we'll be there, depending on if everybody has something, anywhere from 90 minutes to sometimes a little more than 2 hours. I think, you have to really be committed to that, and you have to find other people who are, because not everybody is, and not everybody wants the same kind of feedback either. Some people are looking for just for you to confirm their existence as a writer, which is fine. Other people only want you to say the things that you like, and they get upset and they don't know how to deal with anything that you might think doesn't work. So, and then other people are, sometimes people are mean, sometimes people are wishy-washy. And so sometimes you have to go through some people before you find the right mix of people. And I always think that critique is not about whether you like something or don't like something. It's about whether something works or doesn't work. And you should talk to each other about writing in those terms, and then be able to say why you think it doesn't work and why you think it does work. Because sometimes people are insecure and they might not think that something works, but then the writers group will say, well, yeah, actually that works really well. And, writers group can work for you that way too. But it's all about, for me anyway, questions and observations, that you want people to ask you questions. Once I had actually it was in Looking for Jack Kerouac, the character of Duke, who I love. My agent, at some point, I sent her a draft and it wasn't finished yet. And she asked me about the character Duke. She said, well, did you want him to be such a jerk? And I said, well, he acts like a jerk, but that's not all he is. And she said, that's not there yet. And that was so helpful to me, because then I realized I had to go back through the book and find places where I could complicate him. I could have him do something that sort of balanced out some of the other stuff that he did that wasn't so great. And it was kind of fun. It's a great gift when somebody gives you a piece of information like that about your own work. And you have to learn to think about it that way. we can't read our own writing very well, because when we come to it, we can't help but bring what we wanted it to be and maybe what was in an earlier draft or whatever. And we know what we meant. So we read, when we read, it makes sense to us, but to another reader, it may not make sense. So we have to figure out that gap, between what we think is there and what's actually there. And that's what critique is for. The greatest thing you can do as a writer is learn, just to get rid of your ego and regard that as, like I said, a gift, because it really shortcuts things for you. I love that process.